Hello and welcome to the France 24 interview. On today's programme, we're going to have a look at American foreign policy, particularly as it readjusts to a changing world, and in particular as it readjusts to the rise of China. I have the pleasure of speaking today with a man who's thought a great deal about these issues, Graham Allison, who is director of the Belfer Center and also Professor of Government at Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for having me.
Being with us. Your very latest book, Lee Kuan Yew, is a series of based on a series of conversations with the founding father of Singapore, a man who's able really to give us an insight into a country most of us know very little about, what's going on in China, and yet that the whole world absolutely needs to be paying attention to.
Well, China is the happening of our time. There's just no doubt about it. A country that was smaller than Spain in 1980, its incremental growth last year was amount of GDP bigger than Spain.
It's extraordinary.
So a country that in 1980 was smaller than Spain is now almost 60% of the U.S. and on track next decade to become #1 economy in the whole world. Yeah.
And this is important, not just because it marks a significant shift in the balance of power in the world, but because, as you put it in the book, China isn't simply going to be a big thing. It is going to be the biggest thing the world has ever known.
It's going to be something never seen before. What Lee Kuan Yew says is you just can't quite get it into your head how big this thing is. So if you take all Europeans and all Americans and all Japanese and all Koreans, we still don't have enough people to equal China. So this is something that's never been seen in the world before. And the idea of a country that's got 5,000 years of history, that is accustomed to thinking of itself as the Middle Kingdom, and in the word Chinese, in Chinese means center of the universe. So the idea that it's now going to be restored to its natural place means that everybody else is going to have to adjust. And Lee Kuan Yew is quite eager to kind of say to people, wake up, something big is happening, and you're going to have to adjust yourselves as well as, they'll have to make some adjustments themselves.
But his message is precisely that we just need to get used to the fact, take the psychological leap of accepting it. And a piece of advice really geared towards the United States and its relations in particular, rather than challenging its human rights records, giving it high-minded advice from Washington. His advice is really be far more pragmatic about it, deal with the fact that this marketplace of 1.3 billion people is absolutely going to call the shots within the next 30 years. And rather than, in a sense, upset it now, change your tone.
Well, I think that what he says rightly is that if you look at this, in fact, we asked him the question, well, will China follow the path taken by, let's say, Japan or Germany and accept its place in the global economic and security order that's actually provided the environment in which it grew over all these years? And he says, absolutely not. China wants to be accepted as China, not as an honorary member of the West.
But this is a very difficult step for us to make. And when you read his words, you realize that there's such a great dose of pragmatism in what he says, and ideology in what Washington has tended to say. And really, it's one of the themes throughout the book that he seems to take a very pragmatic advice, sometimes that will surprise Western readers.
He has a nice line in the book, because at one stage we were having just that same reaction, just to precisely what you said. And he said, my objective is not to be politically correct, only to be correct.
And being correct is not about a flawless human rights record. It is not about democracy even. He knocks off its perch in many respects, the advantages or the preeminence of democracy. It's the only factor that we need to judge anything by. And talks instead about economic growth, allowing the best to flourish, protecting the weakest from themselves, but without preventing countries moving ahead economically. It is economic growth, he says, after all, that matters more than anything else.
He says what people mostly care about is their own well-being for themselves, for their families, their chance to have a better economic life, to have more health, to have more freedom for themselves in terms of being able to operate within their own local environment. Where you look at China, and he looks at the China-India comparison, because most Westerners like to tell the Chinese, you know, you should be more like the Indians because they have a democracy of the way we do and they've followed in that tradition. And he says, wait a minute, 600 million people in China have gone from abject poverty to now, you know, making their lives better. 600 million people. Nothing like this ever happened before in the world. And you look at India and you say 40% of Indian children under the age of 5 are malnourished. I mean, that's a shame. I mean, you should just look and you should say, well, but it's a democracy. No, no, no. You should say, how about the human beings' lives first? Yeah.
Yes, that's right. He forces us to rethink, in a sense, ourselves as well, the nature of democracy itself. You make the point in the book that, he makes the point through you in the book that Americans tend to think that they are great because of their ideals. Whilst they have allowed them to be a benign superpower, he says, it is not they that make America great. It is geostrategic good fortune. It is two seas that have protected them largely from difficult conflicts on their soil. And it is this extraordinary ability that the United States has to attract the best talent, to incorporate it, the English language, this innovative culture that it has, not necessarily what Americans think is great about themselves. He sees it in a different way and obliges you to rethink.
Well, you're a good reader and you got right to the heart, because he looks at the competitive advantage of, let's say, U.S. versus China versus India, and he picks out things that most Americans or most French or most Europeans would not pick out. So, for example, what is a great handicap for China, he says? The Chinese language, which he says is like a closed system, almost like a prison, where there's these 4,000 aphorisms that people say to each other, in which they are taught that, well, everything important has been said and has been said better than you can say it. Whereas American English invents new words every day, new concepts every day. So at one stage, advising one of the Chinese leaders, he proposed to them that they should adopt English as their primary language in China. He said, you know, the person couldn't tell whether he was joking or not. But in Singapore, when he's trying to make Singapore into success, they adopted English as their first language. So in Singapore, everybody speaks English, and the second language is China or Chinese or Malay. So who would even imagine some item like that as one of the elements? Now for U.S., he sees the unique advantage is the ability, as just you said, to attract the best people from all over the world. So China, he says, they can recruit from 1.3 billion people. But you can't go to China and become a Chinese. You can't learn Chinese. It's too hard. In any case, if you or I learn Chinese and we're speaking, we can't become a Chinese. Whereas in America, from 7 billion people can come, they learn English, they adapt, Americans accept them, pretty soon they're Americans. So he said that's a great advantage for the U.S., and we should be careful not to screw it up. Yeah.
The point is largely, many of his points are pretty optimistic. Globalization will continue. Globalization is probably a good thing. You deal with specific threats as well. The Islamist threat, for instance, he explains that he explains first of all that it is a battle both between moderate Islam and extreme Islam, as well as between the rest of the world and Islamist fundamentalists. But he explains that just as communism was seen to be a mirage, one day too, in 20 or 30 years' time, the ideals of Islamist extremism will come to be seen as a mirage too.
He thinks that the principal battle will have to be between a sensible, sane Islam, which is the 90%, and the extremist Islamists who have radical ideas, which he thinks are contrary to the forces of modernization in the world, which he thinks will ultimately overcome medievalism. So basically that's the way the battle is going to go, but that it's going to have to mainly be fought. I mean, it's to be a problem for everybody, but it's mainly fought by the Muslims against Muslims as moderate, sensible Muslims finally say to extremists that this is not what Islam is about. This is not what the future is about. This is not what people care about. So, he thinks they're kind of fighting against the forces of history. He's basically very modern. He thinks that the forces of technology, modernization, economic well-being, improvement in people's are what almost everybody wants. And then the question is, how are they going to get access to it?
Yeah. And that perhaps politically, pragmatism will prevail over ideology, not just in the Islamist world or in China, but in Washington as well.
Well, that's where it's very interesting. He says, we ask him the question, well, many people say U.S. is in systemic decline. What do you think? He says, absolutely not. I've seen bad patches in the U.S. where it gets off track or gets stuck in a hole, but it recovers because there's a great capacity for recovery. But he says, as I watch the politics in Washington today and this gridlock, I worry a lot. So, and he part of his message, I think part of what he wants to be kind of almost in your face about is to say, you may think that you have a set of ideas that you're very deeply attached to, and that's kind of your ideology. But ultimately, pragmatically, you're going to have to make some very substantial adjustments to both how you think the world is, because you used to think, or you're accustomed to thinking, well, the U.S. just tells people how things are, and they'll take their place. He says the Chinese are not going to take their place, so that you're going to have as much adjustment in attitude and activity from Europe or from especially U.S. as will China. He thinks, again, there's great worry. He worries about China, not about the current leaders whom he thinks having their families at least come through the Cultural Revolution have some sense for, tragedy. But he says for kids that are growing up now, they've been accustomed to 30 years of China, growing at double-digit rates, their lives improving dramatically. So they may not have as much sense for the adjustment. So he keeps trying to, basically same message to them. Pragmatism says, the world's pretty complicated. It's easy to create tragedies, so do some adjustment.
Let's stay humble.
Yeah.
Graham Allison, thank you very much indeed for having been with us today. It brings us to the end of today's interview here at France 24, but we'll be back very soon for another. Do stay with us.